thank you all for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 1 meeting. This meeting is focused on the supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation topics. This is Christina Osborne from the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. Mark Richardson will facilitate the meeting, and then Bob Cott is going to capture the key takeaways. And we also have Phil Pettengill, who is responsible for the oversight of all 3 active EDAM working groups. He's listed as a panelist as well. The meetings for this working group are held weekly on Mondays and Wednesdays from 1 to 3. Participation details for each of these meetings is available out on the ISO public calendar. So after I do the introductions, Mark will review what was discussed at the last meeting. And then we do have George Angelides from ISO here to present their proposal for potential option for capacity and flexibility test. George isn't listed on the agenda, but he has joined us on video today. And then after George is done with his presentation, he'll turn it back over to Mark to review the relevant RSC topics with the group. And then at the end of the presentation, Bob Cott is going to provide a summary of what was discussed today, and then he'll turn it back to Mark to review the topics for the next meetings. And then just a couple of quick meeting reminders. These working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we do encourage you to ask questions and share your ideas. So if at any time you do have a question or comment, please raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window. If you just dialed in via audio, you'll want to press #2 on your phone. And just as a reminder to please state your name and affiliation first so the rest of the group knows who's speaking. These meetings are recorded. We do post the video files out on the initiative webpage, working group web pages. So before, as always, if you do want to reprint these any related transcriptions, please contact the ISO for permission first. And then if you are interested in presenting at one of the working group meetings, please let us know. There is a link on the resources page at the very end of this presentation. Just submit your request using that link, indicate which working group you'd like to present at, and we'll be in touch. And then also on that resources slide, it does include a link to the working group 1 webpage, the common EDAM design principles, and I believe, sorry, trying to do this from memory, there's other links on that slide to help you engage in the EDAM stakeholder process. That is at the end of this presentation. So with that, I'll turn the meeting over to Mark Richardson.
Thank you, Christina. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I look forward to continuing our discussion on the various topics today, and quickly wanted to reiterate where we left off from Monday's call. On Monday, I had asked Danny Johnson from the ISO and those who were involved in developing the principles to further vet and discuss the 45-day ahead advisory showing offline, and to bring this topic back to this group when more design details are fleshed out. We can vet the value of the advisory showing once it returns to this forum. So I wanted to remind everyone of that. I also wanted to cover some of the common consensus items that I heard and confirm with the audience that everyone's on the same page. So I heard there was a need and a value in having 2 to 3 advisory runs to inform EDAM entities whether or not their supply procurement is sufficient prior to the binding runs. I heard these runs should include the latest forecast information. The timing of these runs sounded like there needed to be a 2-day ahead advisory run, a 6 a.m. advisory run, and then a 9 a.m. advisory run. I also heard several stakeholders voice support of having an ad hoc or on-demand advisory run feature that would allow EDAM entities to kick off on their own. This on-demand run would simply utilize the previous scheduled advisory runs forecast. So say, for example, if an EDAM entity decided to run one of these on-demand advisory runs at, say, 7 a.m., it would utilize the 6 a.m. forecast. I don't want to dictate and take a ton of time from today's meeting on this, but I did want to pause here and hear back from the community to confirm what the consensus on these items were, and that there is value in having these advisory runs. To the extent there are several more details that need to be fleshed out, we can always come back to this. So let me pause and hear from the audience. Jeff Nelson, I saw your hand come up first, so if you don't mind chiming in and unmuting yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. Hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
You know, I, I think consensus is way too strong of a word. I think those were suggestions that were articulated. Uh, Frankly, to me, it sounds very, very excessive. So maybe you can document those and have some sort of poll or something you take to see if there really is consensus. Thanks.
Okay, good idea with the poll. Thank you, Jeff. Tong, if you don't mind unmuting Tong's line for me.
Hi, this is Tong Wu from Wapam. Because you mentioned 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, because last time I mentioned these time, I want to make sure that I was not misinterpreted. I did not suggest multiple runs at all, advisory runs at all. And I did not suggest having a 6 o'clock run and then have a 9 o'clock run again. No, I was saying that if you're going to do any advisory run, you require people to respond. From 6 to 9 is a good time, convenient for people to respond. If you ask people to respond before 6, it'll be too early for people to get up and do work and figuring out what it is. Also, you don't want people to respond after 9 because by 9 the transmission capacity rating should be frozen for the day ahead. That's what I was talking about when I mentioned 6 or 9. I didn't suggest multiple runs at all. And I mentioned that you could do a run 1 day in advance, meaning 2 days in advance of the day ahead. I did not suggest that as a necessary at all. I was thinking if you do that, you want to do it 2 days in advance, do it in the afternoon of the 2 days in advance, because if you do it any earlier, there's not a concrete information that would introduce more uncertainty. I'm thinking a day off test would be better than 2 days. But if other people say, oh, I want a 2 day, that's fine, but do it in the afternoon, 2 days in advance.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
I agree
for your
with
feedback.
Jeff Nelson. There is no conclusion. I don't think there is a consensus at all. Different people raise different opinions, including mine. I just raised my opinion from my organization's perspective.
No, I appreciate that. And I guess I would ask back to the group, is there value in having multiple advisory runs, right? And really, I would like to hear from the EDAM entities if this is something that they would actually utilize. So let me go to Steve Kearns next. Operator, if you don't mind unmuting the line.
Hi, this is Steve Kearns from Public Generating Pool. I think having an on-demand resource efficiency screen that the market participants can use could be very, very valuable. In fact, you might not need any formal advisory screens at all if it's just left up to the market participants so that they can check their own position at any point in time, either in the morning of day -1 or in day -2, so that they know whether or not they have a need that they need to go cure in the bilateral market or to bring other resources on. So I really like that idea. I think that makes it a lot more straightforward. You don't need to have these arbitrary timelines of 6 a.m. or 9 a.m. And it gives the market participant complete control over how they want to view their own portfolio. I think, though, to do that, and George got at some of the challenges with this when he talked about it the other day, was that you might have some forecasts moving around quite a bit during that period of time. So I think maybe one way to deal with that would be to possibly freeze all forecasts and all uncertainty requirements maybe at 6 a.m. of day -1. You may pay a price in accuracy for it, but I think you gain quite a bit in simplicity.
I appreciate that, Steve. Thank you for your remarks. Dan, let me go to you next and see if, is there a need to have a concrete timing of these advisory runs to the extent the ISO team is able to provide, from a technology standpoint, this ad hoc on-demand run? So, operator, if you don't mind unmuting Dan Williams' line, I'd appreciate it.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Before we get to that, can you just restate what the kind of process step was on the 45-day advisory showing discussion?
Sure. Yeah, so where we kind of left off on Monday, and Scott Renzel, I appreciate your time kind of walking through what the original intent was and what the vision was. It sounded like there were quite a bit more details that needed to be flushed out. So instead of trying to flush all those details out based on how, I don't want to say premature the principle was, but kind of getting a little bit more concrete detail as to what it is we're looking to accomplish. And then once that is settled, bring that back to this form, and then we could further discuss, the value in having it and what that might look like.
So are you just taking it back internal, or kind of revisiting with the group that kind of set up the principles in the first place?
Yeah, so I asked Danny Johnson from the ISO to facilitate an offline discussion with that group that built those principles.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying on that. Then when it comes to the advisory run, I'm just kind of thinking about this as we go, as other folks are. But I think what Steve from PGP just suggested, that idea of kind of having a uncertainty forecast and including the VERS forecast, demand forecast locked in at a certain point, then does achieve some of those things that we discussed last time of maybe reduced accuracy to some extent, but gaining efficiency and allowing entities to interact with the market prior to the binding run. And I guess one question that I had was whether that advisory run is intended to sort of publish a demand target, and demand inclusive of uncertainty, or also attempt to count supply. If it's counting supply, then the timing of it gets a little difficult, because you're sort of needing to, as an entity, you need to see that demand target and then figure out what resource decisions you need to make, maybe around gas procurement or hydro assessments and planning, and even assessing, transmission situation, and then having some time to do some trading prior to the binding run. So if there's a tool, though, then I guess that's sort of allows entities to do their own counting of their resources, knowing what the rules are, and compare that to the demand target that exists there in the tool, and sort of update that as they go through their morning activities in multiple areas before the binding run. So just thinking out loud on that stuff, but that's what came to mind.
No, I appreciate your comments. And, given the nature of quote unquote advisory runs, to the extent a party, it's just more information for the EDAM entity, right? It gives them an idea of where they're at in meeting the supply stack needed to be sufficient in their obligations, and we'll define what those requirements and obligations are later on in this working group. So to the extent they don't want to utilize that information, they can simply disregard it. Danny, did you want to chime in on Dan's comments as well? You may be on mute.
Yeah.
Yep, double muted. Yeah, our thinking was to maybe offer some hybrid of a couple advisory runs that would trigger when we lock some of those forecasts that are done at times that would facilitate bilateral trading that entities and participants would need to do to make sure they're resource sufficient, with also some type of, like Mark said, on-demand function that would use preset forecast targets. So I guess from our perspective, we're trying to understand if advisory runs and providing additional information is a bad thing, because it seems like not all participants would support that.
Yeah, I'll leave that as an open question for others. I just want to still have on the table also, though, that I think Michelle Keto from the CPC's question, as we are kind of wrapping up on Monday, around sort of what does this mean for California entities, who have a different way of interacting with the market, maybe relative to then what if you were to just take a utility within the EDAM footprint would, where the utility within the EDAM footprint has sort of a more straightforward way of doing, kind of bilateral procurement to find uncommitted capacity. And so just kind of, it feels like we need to finish that conversation as well. And then also, as I said on Monday, to kind of think about then what this means for uncommitted capacity sort of elsewhere in the West, the IPP and marketer community, and how they sort of engage with the presence of the EDAM and changes that would be happening to the intertie market. And that's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Steve, I see your hand is still up. Did you have another comment? And if not, I will also cover the other item that I captured and then pause and get stakeholder feedback on that as well. Okay, I see Steve dropped his hand. Stuart, I see you. Stuart Kelly from LA. Operator, do you mind unmuting his line?
Thanks, Mark. I think the one thing that I'm struggling with a little bit here, and I welcome that Danny's actually going to come forward with a proposal. It's hard to judge the merits of running tests until we fully understand A, the timing, B, is it just screening, or is there more meaningful information that will come? And then the other thing that we would want to understand, I'm sure, external to CAISO, is if you're bidding in other products, be capacity bid, but whatever the bids are, how that's potentially impacts your setup. And then lastly, the notion is to run this kind of screen, if you will, to give you the opportunity to cure, because we don't know what the outcome of the RSE is going to be if we fail. So it's very difficult to say, yes, I want a screen, I don't want a screen, until we understand some of the specifics. And I think we're lacking a little bit here in getting these specifics out, because we're taking it back to that smaller group, which I appreciate. But where we have at least a proposal in some of this stuff, I would recommend that we document it and circulate it so that folks can talk to the specifics and building on it, because we seem to be jumping around between a bunch of different concepts, and I'm struggling in my own mind how we're going to coalesce all of this by the end of February.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Stuart. And really the goal here is, I understand the RSE has a ton of components and elements to it, but if we can just focus on each of these elements individually, understanding that organically as we start tackling some of these other scope items, they're going to come up again, and then we could further define whatever that common consensus was. For example, right, I heard on the last call, it sounded like a good idea to potentially have 2 or 3 predefined times where this advisory run would kick off. It would lock in the forecast at that associated time and provide entities a quick look at where they stand in meeting the resource efficiency evaluation. What I'm hearing today is it may make more sense to simply offer a on-demand feature for entities as long as they understand when the different forecasts are getting locked in, so that if they run it, say, a day in advance, what was the timing of that? What was the snapshot of that forecast, so that they know what they're comparing it against, right? And to the extent they don't utilize it, that's okay. It's just leading up to the binding RSE forecast, or binding RSE run. We were looking to see if having some informal results prior was beneficial or not. So I appreciate your comments on that, Stuart.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, Mark, we don't yet know what we're going to run and even have a draft of the timelines, because George talked about a screening. It's not a full market run. So,
right.
In order to judge the merits of any of this, we need some kind of proposal written down, I would suggest. And then there obviously is a tie to the RSE, which makes it more difficult to judge, because if there's onerous penalties or whatever for failure, then I'm sure you would want the opportunity to cure.
Right.
before we put in that position.
Yeah, we'll absolutely get into those penalties, but I think Stuart, just for clarification for everybody, when we talk about having a proposal, I think we want to accomplish that as a group, right? And then the ISO can kind of take back all of that feedback from the community and work that into that initial straw proposal. But I did take some notes, Stuart, and I appreciate your comments. Let me go to Kevin Smith.
Yeah, I'm just saying, can we get something in draft before it becomes a proposal? Because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments even in an initial draft.
Yeah, and we'll work through some of those details here in a few slides, Stuart, that may help spur those conversations. Kevin Smith, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Kevin Smith's line, operator, I'd appreciate it, and then I'm going to move on.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Kevin Smith, Balancing Authority, Northern California. I think we beat this thing to death, honestly. I think, but I do appreciate Stuart's observations as usual. But, the simple principle here was that we're going into some kind of a binding RSE. Obviously, we hadn't figured out what the penalty structure is going to be, but what we do know is that we don't want to miss an opportunity to cure a deficiency. So really the intent of this whole thing is to allow the EDAM entity to have sufficient time if there is an instance where they need to go out and do some kind of additional procurement or whatever it is, or I guess the other option is weigh the costs, and if they can't do it, then they have to, whatever the penalty or price of that deficiency is. But that was the intent of it. And then when we start backing this thing out, I mean, at the end of the day, you're really looking at what is the most accurate and meaningful way to accomplish that and give me sufficient time. I mean, for the most part, they're going to know going into the day ahead, where they stand, but there are issues like the diversity and other benefits that get calculated that we can't really factor in. So that's what it is. It's to know kind of where do I stand in this instance and providing sufficient time to cure. That was the principle. We never really got any further than that because I think that's the kind of the idea, is just giving that ability to cure.
I appreciate you laying it out that way, Kevin. Thank you for the background there. And I think that's a good segue to move on. Another item that I believe, and now I'm scared to say common consensus, but where I believed we landed, or at least I didn't hear any pushback, was around the granularity for the advisory and binding RSC run itself to do an hourly check across the full 24-hour period, versus looking at, say, just the peak hours. Let me pause there and see if I can get a reaction from the audience on that. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand. Kevin, I see your hand is still up. I don't know if that's, okay, I see Tong. Go ahead, Tong. Tong, you may be on mute.
I'm sorry, I'm double muted. So I agree with what you said. From WAPA's point of view, I think the RSE should be based on hourly load forecast, not based on the peak, unless you just need a daily assessment. Daily peak assessment is not going to be for 24 hours, just for the peak. If you're going to, apply hourly assessment, it needs to be hourly load forecast, not the peak.
Thank you, Tom. And just to confirm, the RSC would be checking per hour over the full 24-hour horizon. So I want to make sure that was clear. Is there any other comments or feedback on that from the stakeholder community? Does anybody disagree with that, checking the full 24 hours? Let's see. I see Steve Kern.
Yeah, I certainly think that's one way to do it. Another way to consider doing it would be to go back to the peak hours and also do a daily energy test. And one reason that might be better is that if you have energy limited resources such as Northwest Hydro, but have sufficient capacity, there's a lot of shaping that you can do to that resource so that you may have less generation off peak and more generation on peak. So I think it's a question we need to think through, is that if you have enough energy to meet your energy for the day, and sufficient capacity to meet your peak load, is it okay to be short on some hours? And the reason you might be short on some hours is dependent upon the uncertainty requirement that's associated with it. So if there was a bullet in one of the original presentations that talked about accumulating uncertainty over many hours. And one of the concerns I have with that approach and with the hourly approach is that you could be requiring entities to carry a lot of additional energy to meet those uncertainty obligations, or to meet that uncertainty.
Thank you, Steve. So, I think what I'm hearing is we may need to come back to this advisory run concept, after we further define the structure of the RSC, and possibly even after we discuss some of those consequences. So I'll make a note of that to make sure we come back. All right, let's see here. All right, so for today, first of all, thank you everyone for your feedback. I appreciate it. Your feedback is encouraged and definitely needed. So for today, I would like to continue group discussion on the forecasts utilized from the RSC. I believe it was Stuart Kelly from LA that talked about potentially allowing EIM entities to have the option to provide their own forecasts. And I believe this was driven based on some accuracy concerns. Prior to hearing from Stuart, however, I have asked George Angelides from the ISO to provide what a potential option would be for both the capacity and flexibility tests, and want to hear back on these concepts from the group. My hope is that George's discussion helps shape up our main discussion points for today, for what resources and supply qualifies for the RSC and what their associated accounting rules are. Trying to keep in mind, going back to what we've heard time and time again, is the RSC is intended to be a screening. So with that, George, if you don't mind pulling up your presentation and taking it away.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me try to share this. And if I have a confirmation whether this is visible.
You're good, George.
Thank you. So as Mark set up the stage here, I want to take a few moments providing a framework, really, not really having the just ultimate way that this can be done. We have all pondered different ways, and we know how we're doing it in EIM, so certainly leverage the ability from there that we have to present potential ways that we can use in the EDAM resource sufficiency evaluation. That is the goal. So this is the objective. All right, so we don't want to close any doors here. Everything is on the table. We just want to provide a framework and discuss ideas and principles. The principles that I list here, we have discussed before. Essentially, as I mentioned several times before, this RSC is really meant to be a screen, not really a full optimization problem. We don't want to run the market before we run the market, so it has to be simple, yet at the same time as comprehensive as possible. We want it to be transparent, we want it to be reasonable, and of course easy to implement. And at the end, we'll have to find a suitable trade-off out of all these principles. You may have seen this slide before in a previous call in this work group. There were questions, what does it mean to participate from a resource perspective in the resource sufficiency evaluation and the market? And I want to reiterate here to make sure that in our view, participation means submitting schedules and bids through the infrastructure that we have through cyber for use in both the resource sufficiency evaluation and the market. And when I say bids, I'm also including self-schedules. This is a form of a bid. So only if a resource does not submit any bids whatsoever for the 24 hours of the trading day, you can say that this resource does not participate in the market because it will not get a day-ahead schedule, it will not get a financial position, it will not get a settlement. So in any other way, any submission of a bid essentially indicates participation and will use that bid, both in the resource sufficiency evaluation and in the market afterwards. So again, the purpose of the resource sufficiency evaluation is to make sure that its EDAM BAA meets its own reliability requirements. And I stress here that this is based on the physical bids. So even if the EDAM BAA allows virtual bids, we don't consider the virtual bids, at least that's what the proposal is here. We don't consider the virtual bids in the resource sufficiency evaluation because we want the resource sufficiency evaluation to be pragmatic and physical. I don't see the value of having a resource sufficiency evaluation when it has virtual contributions to it. Of course, we would like to hear from you on that topic as well. And when we say meet its reliability requirements here, what we said before is that what are these requirements? We're looking at the hourly demand forecast. So that's an hourly granularity, as Mark mentioned earlier, and others. And superimpose on that demand forecast the uncertainty requirements, upward and downward. And I mentioned before that we intend to leverage the mechanisms that we have in the flexible ramp refinements initiative for calculating those uncertainty requirements, which are a blend of historical data as well as the current most up-to-date forecast that we have for the demand and also for variable energy resources. And to go back to the discussion that involved Stuart Kelly on what forecast we use. I think it's easy to agree here that we want to use the best possible forecast, the most accurate forecast that we have available. It may be a forecast that the ISO forecast model produces, or it may be the forecast that the participant produces. We have to establish a way to come up with historical observations, which is a better forecast, and this is the one that we want to use. Now, the second sub-bullet here is hourly ancillary service requirements. We do want to include this in the resource sufficiency evaluation test. Ancillary service requirements are part of the reliability requirements of an EDAM PAA, and irrespective of whether we decide later on in these work groups to co-optimize ancillary service for the entire EDAM footprint, or just simply have EDAM BAAs declare their resources and the capacity that they allot for meeting their ancillary service requirements, and we keep this fixed, we don't optimize them. In any case, we want to make sure that the ancillary service requirements, the way they're declared by EDAM BAAs, are met with the resources that are participating in the market. So those two are basically a capacity test, essentially making sure that there is enough capacity participating in the market in the form of bids that they can meet these hourly requirements. And the other side of the coin is the flexibility. We want to make sure that although the capacity is in place, we want to make sure that it's flexible enough to address changes in the reliability requirements across hours. And in the day-ahead market with 24 hours, it's not as simple as just taking from 1 hour to the next, because as your resources are ramping up and coming closer to your upper economic limit, or your upper capacity of the resource, that may limit the flexibility of the resource for the following hours on the same ramp if the demand forecast is ramping up. So we really want to have some test that has a cumulative nature, where we want to make sure that cumulatively the demand forecast and uncertainty requirements are met across consecutive hours. So that's a topic that we use currently in EIM. So in this proposal, we propose to leverage this functionality and of course adapt it to the EDAM situation, and I'll have some more details on that in the next slide. Very important, what we discussed here in the past, and it's one of the principal aspects of the EDAM when it comes to resource efficiency evaluation, we have the ability that BAAs can assist each other in passing the test by declaring products that can be provided by one BAA to another using the bucket one transmission, bucket one transfer. So to take that into consideration in the resource efficiency evaluation, essentially we can adjust the requirements, basically the hourly demand forecast and uncertainty requirements, or even the ancillary service requirements, by any bucket one transfers that are defined and declared before the resource efficiency evaluation, before the market, from one BA to another. So this is our proposal to basically support a system where it's different than what we have in EIM. In EIM, all transmission is free, so transmission that is released is free. So what we do there is we socialize the diversity benefit. We allocated pro rata to every BAA, so we reduce every BAA's requirements by a pro rata amount of what we consider to be the diversity benefit. And that EIM concept is different here. It doesn't apply in EDAM because here transmission is not all of it free. And we wanted to provide the ability for actual contractual obligations to take place, which are formalized with the submission of bucket one transfers, which are a BAA to BAA concept. So you will see a difference in that respect. And of course, this is used in the resource efficiency evaluation. After that, when we go to the market, if the BAA is passing the RSC sufficiency evaluation, then obviously there is economic displacement that can take place in the market, and that can use all transmission that is made available under all buckets. Bucket 1, 2, and 3, they're all available in the market to optimize and achieve the most efficient outcome. We'll have a little bit of discussion here, what could happen if you don't pass the RSC. I'm going to leave that for the end of this presentation, but I think we'll agree that if a BAA is passing the RSC, then it's really fully participating in EDAM and has the ultimate benefit of every potential optimization that can be achieved by the market. Before I move on, let me make sure and verify, essentially, because I'm not saying new things here, verify that the audience is in agreement with those general principles that I lay out here. I can't see any hands raised, so Mark, if you can help me if there are any comments.
Absolutely, George. Let's do Jeff Nelson first. Operator, if you don't mind unmuting his line.
Hey, George. Good afternoon again. I'm struggling on whether the RSC is going to be what I thought you talked about last time, just sort of an accounting instantaneous sort of check, or if it's going to be some flavor of a power flow. And so can you talk to that? And I guess it's really getting to a couple of questions.
Sure.
What if you have bids, but they're not simultaneously feasible?
Yeah. So these are good questions, Jeff. And again, if I go back to the principles, really we have to find a reasonable trade-off between accuracy and simplicity. Obviously, we don't want to run a power flow, so the RSC is not a full transmission feasibility. We do want to take into consideration the resource limitations. Basically, the bid range, the ramp capability for sure. We're going to get a little bit more in detail on that when we start discussing about energy limitations that have been discussed in the past before. So I want to bring that up, that this is in our radar. We have discussed at some point. So this is about resource limitations. So they participate in the market, they submit bids, but do the bids say the whole story about how the resource can participate, or there are other limitations that we need to consider? But we don't plan or propose to have any kind of transmission feasibility, because that will require some form of either a power flow or a formal optimization. And if we go to that level of complexity, obviously we won't be able to provide this on-demand nice screen tool, right? So we'll have to find the appropriate balance between accuracy and simplicity. I hope this provides some clarity.
Yeah, it does. So it
Yeah,
sounds like a little bit of a hybrid tool, but it won't be a power flow.
yeah, and
Just one real
Jeff,
quick question. Yes.
go ahead, Jeff.
How about at the border of the EDAM? So if you've got a balancing authority, let's just say that it's touching California to the, I guess, the east of California, for example, but there's nothing to the east of that balancing authority that's part of EDAM. Let's just say Arizona and whatever, Utah or whatever is next to Arizona isn't participating. How are bids at the border of EDAM treated?
Very good question, Jeff. Can you hold on that? I think this is the
Sure,
last point in my presentation. The very last point. There is a reason why I left it for the very last. So let's touch upon on that particular topic at the end of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, George.
All right, I'm going to call on, I'm trying to keep mindful of our time. I'm going to call on Kathleen Colbert. We haven't heard from her yet today. And then, George, if you wouldn't mind walking us through the capacity test on your next slide. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Thank you.
This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I appreciate the discussion so far today. Always helpful. I just wanted to respond and say, George, I kind of asked a question about, is there consensus? I think that when we talk incredibly high level, things all sound fairly fine, right? But the devil's in the details. And so I think we're going to get to that with the rest of your presentation. I did want to say that reserving judgment until we keep talking about some of these stickier policy questions about what are we trying to test? What's the harm we're concerned about?
Fair.
All that stuff. But I appreciate this presentation. I'm really looking forward to the next couple parts. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. And yeah, that's a fair statement. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we don't have any red flags at this point because it will be difficult to move on. If this looks good, then we can move to some more details. Again, this is a proposal. So let me talk a little bit about the capacity test, and I say hourly capacity test. The intent of the proposal is to perform this for every hour. And I'm gonna go very high level here. I may be using some symbols that I use in equations that I have in previous documents that we have released on the real-time market and day-ahead market enhancements designs. So essentially, this block here for that capacity represents the aggregate capacity of the resources in a BAA that are in the market. They submitted a bid, so there's a minimum capacity and there's a maximum capacity. You can say that these are the aggregate Pmin and Pmax. And it is understandable that the participation is for a portion of that capacity with energy bid. So you have a lower economic limit, or basically this represents the total level of self-schedule that is submitted to the market. And then there is a bid on top of that up to the upper economic limit. And there is capacity that is in the market for ancillary services above that. There are ancillary services in the market that do not require a bid submission in the day-ahead market, like contingency reserves and regulation. We do require a bid for imbalanced reserves. I want to show that next. So essentially, the top part of the capacity of a resource can be consumed with the regulation up requirements and contingency reserve requirements. I'm using a generic term for both spin and non-spin as contingency reserve requirement. I think this is probably the direction we'll be going soon or at some point in the near future. So I'm not going to be speaking differently for spin and non-spin. I'm using the term contingency reserve as both of those. So I'm showing that this can be on the top of the capacity. You don't require a bid submission for these services in the ahead. And then the regulation down requirements from the bottom part. And then when you have your demand forecast here, and I just said earlier, we intend to use the best demand forecast that we have available. That's for everyone's benefit. We stack up above and below the demand forecast the uncertainty requirements. So these are the imbalance reserve up requirement and the imbalance reserve down requirements. So for this, we do require a bid. So we expect a bid to cover these services. And how we're going to perform the capacity test in a simple manner, again, we want to make sure that the bids or schedule declarations that we have from an EDAM BAA for the ancillary services. For each ancillary service, they cover the requirements. So, and again, this doesn't matter whether we optimize whether we procure optimal ancillary services, in which case this could be bids. It could be just declarations like self-provision. There's some form of a declaration of where the resources are and what capacity is assigned to these resources for meeting the ancillary services. It's a very simple test to make sure that we get enough in the market to meet your requirements, also for contingency reserves. So this is very straightforward. And also for the imbalance reserve requirements, lending, taking elements from the day-ahead market enhancements where we have bids for these commodities. We have to make sure that there are enough bids in the market from resources in the BAA to meet the uncertainty requirements, the way we calculate them for each hour. So that's a first tier of capacity test, very simple. It gets a little bit more complicated now when we are looking to the second tier, and specifically we want to make sure that energy bids cover the imbalance reserve. So there has to be enough energy bid. So this is your difference from the upper economic limit and the demand forecast to cover your imbalance reserve requirements up. So you have to cover that, and then also in the downward direction, you won't be able to cover your imbalance reserve down requirements because bids are required for this, and the reason that they're required is because we optimize them. This capacity here on the energy bid could be optimally allocated between an energy schedule or an imbalance reserve product. So we need the bid to be able to optimize those. And then you have another tier which, looking at the entire capacity that's available, it has to be, the downward capacity has to be sufficient to accommodate all your downward products, so both imbalance reserve down and regulation down. Okay, and we're looking at the upper direction, make sure that there is enough upward capacity to accommodate your upward services, which is imbalance reserve, contingency reserve, and regulation now. So the math is really simple, and this is straightforward. You can do it in an Excel spreadsheet or even by hand if you have, a small number of resources. So we want to keep it simple. It's very easy to find out if you're short and what you can do to remedy that. You just add some more bids. You bring some more resources into the market, right? It's very simple. So that's the hourly capacity test, and I want to go next to the flexibility test and then open for questions. So for the flexibility test, and the way I present it here is as a cumulative ramp capability test. So we're looking at the profile, at the demand profile that we have for that BAA that we're performing the test across the 24 hours. We're identifying, and we superimpose, of course, the imbalance reserve requirements, imbalance reserve up on top of the demand, imbalance reserve down below the demand. So we identify patterns where the requirement is increasing across hours, the requirement is decreasing across hours, and our objective is to see if we have enough flexibility to cover those upward and downward ramps. Resources that participate in the market can be optimally scheduled, so we give it the benefit of the doubt here. We say the optimization will be able to do the best to maximize the flexibility out of the available fleet in the market. So for the upward test, we start from a position where we say the resources are going to move to their lower economic limit, the absolute bottom that the market can schedule. It's limited by the sub-schedule, but we use that location and we say from that point on, if we start ramping the resource, and this is a cumulative ramp across hours and from all the resources that participate in the market, do we have enough flexibility to meet those cumulative ramps? And again, we're looking at cumulative ramps because resources that are meeting that point here in this cross-hour ramp, some of them, they may nearing their upper capacity limit and they're not available to ramp anymore. So that's why you have to look at the cumulative fashion, all right, and see if all these ramps can be met. Again, the math is really simple. From each resource, we're taking the ramp capability over this cumulative 60-minute ramps added to the lower economic limit, which is as low as we can get the resource in the market. We cap it from the upper economic limit because it's as high as we can move the resource in the market for energy and imbalance reserve. And then we want to make sure that we can hit those points, which is the demand plus the uncertainty up requirement. So for each hour, you have this cumulative test with a pass or fail. If you have enough flexibility to meet this point or not. In a similar fashion, in the downward direction, we're looking in the opposite direction and say if the market has the ability to move all your resources in your upper economic limit, the highest point that we can meet, then is it capable? Is there enough flexibility in the fleet to meet all those downward ramps? And it's a similar math here. It looks at the ramp, at the downward ramp requirement over the cumulative 60-minute ramps to meet those points, which is demand minus imbalance reserve down. Okay. This is as simple as I can present it. As I want to just go over the concept, and it's not really much different than what we have in EIM as the flexible ramp sufficiency test today, where we actually have a cumulative test that looks at the ramps, at the cumulative ramp from an initial point before the hour that we perform the test to every 15-minute interval in that hour. So this is a similar concept, but there we have an initial point. Here we don't have an initial point. We start from an arbitrary point. Let's say, okay, when we're looking for upward ramps, we say, let's start from the lowest point that we can move the resources and see if there is enough flexibility to cover all these upward ramps. And the other way around, let's start from the highest point that we can move the resources, that the market can move the resources to see if there is sufficient flexible ramp down to cover those ramps. And there is an attestation here, an assumption that, you know, if you can meet those extreme ramps, then even though we don't know what the optimal schedule is going to be during the trading day, we are reasonably assured that you have enough flexibility to participate in the market without leaning on others. I want to emphasize against the point that, you know, these targets, we will adjust them with any bucket one transfers that are declared in the market, and this is the mechanism where one BA can assist another BA in terms of meeting their energy requirement and the superimposed uncertainty requirement. So we take that into account. So let me pause here. Maybe this is extreme level of information, but we did have a request to provide a little bit of clarity and framework on one possibility that we could perform this test in. Again, we have to weigh in accuracy and simplicity. So let's see if what comments people have on this.
Thank you, George. Let me go to Dan Williams first. Operator, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Dan's line.
Hi, yeah, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Thanks for going through that, George. There's a lot to think through here, and I feel like we kind of keep circling back to asking foundational questions because at least for me, it's sometimes difficult to map to maybe what your understanding is of how everything can and should fit together, just because we don't have something simple laid out for us of like a timeline and a general market concept that that kind of grounds everything. So I'll just put that out there. But the two clarifying questions that I had, one is around the ancillary service requirements. How do you account for the fact that the AS requirements are sort of sensitive to the way that the market settles in the IFM run, as far as around like interchange schedules impacting the spin and non-spin requirements, and then potentially too, just operator discretion around setting the regulation procurement targets?
Excellent question, Dan. Thank you. Let's try to address the first question. I don't have the perfect answer. We currently do not have a mechanism in our markets, both day ahead and real time, to actually have a dynamic assessment or calculation of what is the ancillary service requirement depending on how the market solves. specifically with respect to the fact that you may have transfers now as an optimal schedule from the market, which may affect what is your, for example, your logic contingency when you're determining the ancillary service requirements. So traditionally, and what we do today, these are set ahead of time. So you have to make an estimation of what is your exposure to potential contingencies. For the California ISO, we consider the Pacific DC intertie as the single largest contingency, and we have calculations to determine how much is the larger contingency in that respect, so that we include it in the ancillary service requirements. And I bring that only as an example. Every BAA, and they have their own procedures in meeting their reliability requirements, and we do not want as a market operator to interfere with that. As we said repeatedly in these proceedings here, the job of maintaining reliability is squarely staying with the BAA. It's not a market concept. It's a reliability concept that the BAA is responsible for. All we need to do here to operate the market is for its BAA to let us know which are the ancillary service requirements that they plan to their operation for the next day, and make sure here that two things. First of all, that you do have the capacity and the ramp to meet these requirements so that you don't lean on others. And second, to make sure that the market outcome does not compromise your ability to meet these requirements. For example, in EIM today, when an EIM BAA declares spin capacity on a certain resource, we make sure that when we dispatch that resource that participates in EIM with a bid, we don't enter into the capacity that is reserved for ancillary services for spin. And we want to do the same here, even if we don't optimize ancillary services with energy, which is one of the items that probably we'll discuss at some point. So I think this was your first question, right?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. So you'd be kind of leaning on the balancing authorities to give their best estimate, and then with the understanding that things will change between the day ahead and the real time, and maybe the RUC process further clarifies or something in between the two.
I will hold my comments for RUC, because currently the way we have designed RUC for the day-ahead market enhancements, it has the ancillary services fixed at the IFM schedule. We're not revisiting them in RUC. The only thing that RUC does is procures reliability capacity. So we'll get into that at some point. But yeah, so we don't touch the ancillary services in RUC. This is really an IFM schedule outcome that will either co-optimize or accommodate energy and ancillary services as day-ahead schedules.
Okay, so then real time takes over and can make adjustments at that point. I guess the other question is just, I'm still struggling a little bit to understand what you're envisioning around the declared bilateral energy capacity transfers. Just sort of how you expect that to kind of happen efficiently. Is it a centrally cleared concept? Just kind of what the utility is of that, and how you envision it all kind of coming together.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, so of course, I'm thinking simply about this. Again, I'm leveraging concepts that we have already in place in the ISO market. We have the concept of ancillary service trades. So we can leverage that and have it here in EDAM as transfers. So again, transfer is a BA to BA concept, so it doesn't see specific resources or scheduling coordinates from one BA to another. They're all aggregated at the BA to BA level, and they have to be declared, these transfers, as bucket one transfers before we're on the market, before we're on the RSC. And to give you an example, let's say BA1 has a surplus of capacity and a surplus of flexibility, and they can market that by having a contract with BAA2, which needs these elements to pass the test or make their resource planning for the next day. and they agree on a bucket one transfer. They declare it to the market operator. We'll have to discuss how. I wanted to have this registered in the master file as constructs that we know about it in advance, and before we run the market by 10 a.m., you declare how much is the capacity that's going to be used on a specific contract, similar to the transfers that we have in EIM. We have them registered in the master file, and the limit on the scheduling limit on the transfer is submitted even in real time. So in a similar fashion, the BAAs, and we get this information from one BAA that is defined in the master file as the BAA that submits the information, which is also visible to the other. This is logistics. At the end, basically the BAAs that have this contract, they will declare to the market operator a transfer from one BAA to the other on a specific intertie, so that we know how it's going to be tagged under bucket one. So it's going to be a bucket one transfer, and the capacity that's going to be used and the type of the transfer. It's going to be an energy transfer or an imbalance reserve up requirement transfer. And then in the resource efficiency evaluation, when we calculate these targets, or in the previous slide that I had on the capacity test, when we calculate the targets, essentially we transfer a requirement from the BAA that is buying the product to the BAA that is selling the product. So for example, let's say there is an energy transfer of 200 megawatts from BAA1 to BAA2. In the resource efficiency evaluation, we go to the demand forecast for BAA2 and we reduce it by 200 megawatts. And we go to the BAA1 demand forecast and we increase it by 200 megawatts. So that essentially memorializes the bucket one transfer of 200 megawatts of capacity for meeting demand forecast between BA1 and BA2. We do the same for imbalance reserve up. If there is an imbalance reserve up transfer for 50 megawatts, we reduce the upward uncertainty for BA2 by 50 megawatts, and we add 50 megawatts to the upward uncertainty for BA1. And that bucket one transfer for 50 megawatts essentially reserves transmission for the transfer of that energy when it's going to be deployed. But this is only on paper for the RSC test on paper, let's say for the screen. When we go to the market, at that point, we optimize all the available transmission. So that doesn't mean that this 50 megawatt needs to go this way. The market may find a more efficient way to do it, using another BA, using another transfer. So we'll let the market do its thing. But for the purpose of the resource efficiency evaluation, we use what the BAAs declare as bucket one transfer to perform the test. Now, did that provide some clarity?
It does, but it also introduces so many questions around price formation and efficient transacting, and what role is doing what function in the market. It seems somewhat comprehensible for vertically integrated utilities who are the BA, they are the scheduling coordinator and the load serving entity, but strains a little bit when you get out into the more complex makeup of different EIM and future EDAM BAs. But I'll just leave room for others to ask questions as I kind of digest that.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
All right, let me go to Jeff Spires next. Operator, if you don't mind unmuting Jeff Spires' line.
Hi, good afternoon. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Just a suggestion for this working group that I think is kind of just thinking back to some of Stuart's comments about, having something down on paper is kind of a good place to start. And George, I think your concepts and thoughts here on one potential approach help with that, because it gives us something to look at and to think about. But the suggestion is that in the other work group for transmission, Kathy Anderson presented some of the older materials that the EIM entities had put together a couple of years ago around what the thinking was and sort of the concept around the various buckets. And I think that was really helpful in that work group to provide a better sense of kind of what that concept was all about. And it was a really valuable discussion. And so I was just thinking that maybe that would be a good idea for this work group to go through some of the older materials that had been put together by the EIM entities back pre-COVID that tried to explain what the vision was from the EIM entities around resource sufficiency, both, kind of from the higher level conceptual point of view, but also some of the thinking and ideas around how some of the mechanics could potentially work. So just wanted to throw that out there as a suggestion for a future meeting as putting forward some other approaches and thoughts around this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And as Mark mentioned, we do welcome potential presentations from market participants as long as you let us know about it, and we'll reach out to you to coordinate for a presentation like that. So if there are older material that you or others feel that it will be constructive to present here, by all means, we will facilitate this process, and we'll definitely make it happen.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, George.
All right, I'm gonna go to one more individual, and then we'll move on. I've seen Stuart Kelly in the queue for quite a while. Go ahead, Stuart.
Thank you, Mark. George, first, I really appreciate committing a potential approach to paper. So I welcome that. Thank you. And I do recognize the statement around pursuing the best available forecast. I think looking at slide 5, it highlights, I believe, the concern I may have. If you look at a demand forecast, let's say at interval T that's, let's say, 7% lower than actual, and then the demand forecast at interval 3 plus 3 is, let's say, 18 to 20% higher. If that demand forecast is off that much, that obviously, I believe, and you can confirm, puts significant strain on trying to pass those tests, both in an upward direction and indeed in a downward direction. And if you were to take the forecast that's off and then add the IR, or the balance up and balance down component to it, there's a potential to compound that uncertainty and truly megawatt for megawatt compound that issue. I just get validation that, if the forecast is off that much, it's really going to skew the test first and foremost. And then I think that opens up potentially a dialogue at a later point on, metrics we'd be shooting for, or, alternative forecasts or whatever, because I would expect a day ahead forecast to be around maybe, within 3% or at least 5%, but I've seen stuff as high as 18. But if you would just want to validate my concerns, correct, and or correct me if we're going wrong.
The percentages that you're referring to, Stuart, I just want to make sure I understand. You're probably referring to the forecast accuracy comparing to real time. You're not really referring to differences between forecasting models. I wouldn't expect to have such a high difference between two different forecasting models, let's say the ISO forecast model and, let's say, an EDAM entity forecast.
Correct. I'm referring to, if I look at existing forecasts day ahead to the actual demand being off in certain intervals by that much. We've experienced that. Our topography is different within LA, DWP. We've got the coast, downtown, and the valley that probably, would suggest maybe we're better, we're zonal. But when you compare the day ahead, which isn't a focus for EIM, to the actual, there can be quite a disparity. But my concern is if you rolls into this test, then we've probably got a problem, right?
All right, so that's why I asked that clarifying question, because if you're comparing day-ahead forecast with real-time forecast, the difference between those two factors into those uncertainty requirements. The demand forecast is the 50th percentile day ahead here, and we calculate the uncertainty requirement that reflects how much in error that demand forecast at 50th percentile could be in real time. And we're not going, in the day-ahead market enhancements, we go from day-ahead to FMM. Don't go all the way to RTD for various reasons. But if you're comparing those two forecasts, the difference, a lot of that percentage, a great amount of that percentage is captured by those uncertainty requirements. I think your issue is, what do you calculate as the 50th percentile, and then what's the level of accuracy on calculating these uncertainty requirements? For the uncertainty requirements, I haven't heard a lot of comments on our proposal for using what we have in the Flexible Ramp Refinements Initiative. I think that went through. And of course, we have to learn a lot about it. We have a lot of caveats. It's a new approach. We're going to monitor it, make a commitment to always make an effort to improve it and make it as good as we can. When it comes to the 50th percentile day ahead forecast, I thought your issue is that, you may have that provided also by an EDAM entity, not only from the ISO. And the question is, who has the better forecasting model? And we want to use the very best one. And I don't think that the difference between those two will be at such a high percentage. There may be a few percentage points. We still want to use the obviously the most accurate forecast in the long run. But I don't think it will have such a dramatic impact on the requirements for the test. We're talking probably a few percentage points. More of the impact will be in the calculation of imbalance reserve requirements of the uncertainty. And on that, we're already committed to do the best possible thing that we can. So I hope this is a satisfactory answer to you.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful, George, and I'm sure we'll get into the detail of the balance reserve requirement. So it's not effectively compounding it. So that's helpful to know. And ISO's putting a lot of effort into helping improve, LE's forecast. So we appreciate that also. But thank you for that explanation.
All right. I'm trying to be mindful of time here, George, and I see a few others with their hands raised, so I apologize I hadn't been able to get to you quite yet. Kathleen, I made a note that you're in the queue, and I'll definitely call on you shortly. George, did you want to also cover, outside of these previous two slides, some of the resource characteristics that we may need to consider in the RSC? Those are some of the details that I'm also going to be walking through in the previous presentation on a resource type basis. I don't know if you wanted to frame that up a little bit before we dive in, or pass it back to me.
I would like to just state them so that we all know that we have them in a radar screen. I don't really want to spend too much time discussing them at this point maybe, but we definitely need to discuss this. So what I presented so far is very high level. It sets up a framework of how these calculations can be performed, but there is the second tier of a little bit of more detail, where, of course, the complexity always lies, that we have to make some discussion and maybe reach some consensus on something simple and reasonable. Again, we have to find a reasonable trade-off between those two. So we do have participation from resources. We use their capacity and their bids and the ramp capability to perform the test. But is the energy bid sufficient to tell us all about the capabilities of a resource? There are other elements that affect the resources performance in the market that to a certain degree we need to potentially consider them. And one of them, I'm listing a few here. So it's the resources that are offline at the beginning of the trading day. Let's say this is their initial condition. Depending on their startup time, they may not be able to contribute to the resource efficiency evaluation before they actually complete their startup time, if we assume that they're starting up as soon as possible. So we'll have to take that into consideration. They may have bids in the market for for all the hours of the day, but we cannot consider them in the RSC before their startup time is actually elapsed. So if it takes maybe 5 hours for a resource to start, and its minimum downtime is completed by the beginning of the market, I'm just bringing an example, that resource, although it has bids, it won't be able to contribute in the resource sufficiency evaluation for the first 5 hours because it will take that much to start up. And in a similar manner, we want to recognize the fact that MSG, multi-state generators, they have a complex operation that involves different configurations and the state transitions between these configurations. So we also want to have some accommodation of that, particularly when we do the flexibility test. Let's say we're trying to find out how an MSG can contribute in the upward flexibility. We need to factor in state transitions and see what the contribution of the resource is, starting all the way from, the low configuration, transitioning upward to a higher configuration eventually. So there is a little bit of complexity, but I believe it's necessary to, one way or another, somehow consider it in the test. So these are just examples on the discontinuous operation of resources that may affect the resource sufficiency evaluation calculations. And then we start moving into an area where there are energy limits for resources. So you may have the bids to participate in the market, but maybe you cannot participate fully of the entire trading day because there are some energy limitations. This is probably relevant most for hydro resources with water restrictions, that there may be water behind the dam that you can just indiscriminately discharge as much as you want, although you have a bid in the market. There is a daily energy limit that we observe in IFM actually as a constraint, and could be also in RAC. So we need to somehow recognize that and come up with some reasonable way to reflect that in the calculations for the resource sufficiency. How we have to discuss. There are different ways to do it. Traditional utility approach from the old days, you were using the hydro resources for peak saving. That's not the most optimal way, but maybe it's one way that we can assume as a pattern for hydro resources and use that within the daily energy limit to say how they contribute to the resource sufficiency evaluation. Or alternatively, say, well, the hydro resources have a superior ramp. We're going to use them during the on-ramp and off-ramp period. So that's another assumption we may go with. But at the end, we'll have to come up with some reasonable profile for the participation of hydro resources with energy limits so that then we can use that in the resource sufficiency evaluation. Same happens with energy storage resources. They have a state of charge limitation. These resources, invariably, they can be, useful in providing flexibility for, let's say, 4 hours, the 4-hour resource. But it's not only 4 hours for a specific 4-hour period in the day. There might be multiple periods because you can have multiple cycles. So again, we have to come up to some agreement and understanding here and come up with a profile of how these resources would be effectively used for the purpose of the RSC calculations. Maybe you can have 2 cycles, charging at the night, firing up during the morning ramp, and then again charging the valley, firing up for the evening ramp or afternoon ramp. Something like that. It's food for thought. I just want to bring this up as elements that need to be in a radar, the merit discussion, and I don't want to disregard them. There are other types of resources that may require specific considerations in the RSA, like demand response resources. Maybe they're not available all the time. Maybe they're program limitations, specific hours of the day, or the number of hours in the day. We need to take that into consideration. Variable energy resources, they participate with bids, but there's a limit to how much they can participate due to their forecast. So usually, and that's the proposal for Datum, we limit the schedule and the capacity awards, the demand to the forecast for these resources. And if they want to take a financial position above the forecast, they can participate with virtual supply bids if this is allowed for the EDAM PAA. Another consideration then with respect to variable energy resources further handled. And at the end, I'm going to go to, I think it was Jeff Nelson maybe that had this question. One of the participants had a question earlier. How do we handle intertie resources at the EDAM boundary when it comes to the resource efficiency evaluation? I left that for last because this is a sensitive topic and could be controversial because it brings in questions about how external resources can participate in the in EDAM and whether they can have intertie bids or not. This is an issue that I don't know if you remember from the energy imbalance market. There was an agreement for the EIM not to have intertie bids at the boundary of EIM, with the exception of the ISO scheduling points. And this merits discussion in this work groups on how we're going to go about this in EDAM has a direct impact on the resource efficiency evaluation, whether intertie resources can participate at all, whether it can participate only with self-schedules, which means they don't provide flexibility, but they can meet some of your demand forecasts, or whether they can have intertie bids and products, capacity products, in which case they can participate more, even for flexibility. So as you can see, there is a whole slew of questions that, you know, we have to at some point discuss and provide an answer. I'm just listing what came in top of my mind right now. There's probably more. I just want you to just keep in mind that these are open for discussion. At some point, we'll have to get to the details of discussing this. The last two slides in this presentation are only starting to bring in the topic of what does it mean to fail the test. And I want to reserve this discussion for later. I want to turn this up to Mark now, and if there is time, we can go to that and start on the discussion on that. I heard from Stuart that this will be useful, and others to understand what does it mean really to fail the resource efficiency evaluation test, so that we can understand what the value that the resource efficiency evaluation test provides and what are the consequences. So I think we definitely have to touch upon these topics probably sooner rather than later. So Mark, with that, I go back to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, George. I appreciate you laying everything out. Christina, if you don't mind. Okay, perfect. So maybe before I dive into what I planned on covering today and discussing as a group, you know, George laid out what the ISO believes to be the forecast, where it includes a level of uncertainty and a level of reserve. You know, I would like to hear back from the audience on if that makes sense and if there's an agreement there. Kathleen, I talked about going to you next, so I'm going to go to you. And then I saw Bobby Olson in the queue as well. So Kathleen, if you don't mind chiming in.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Great. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Appreciate the formulations and I'm looking forward to the charts. So thanks for everything. I don't think it's too detailed, George. I think that stuff is great. Thank you. I think that, you know, and it really highlights, I think, the thing that most of us are struggling with, which is that from a mechanics perspective, there's not a ton of probably controversy. It's really the policy questions that are the things I think we're struggling with. Because what you showed makes a lot of sense, right? And so I wanted to just kind of flag some of those questions and see, Mark, if you could capture these. Some of the things that came to mind is actually you just teed up one of them I wanted to say. You know, Tong, I think in one of our prior meetings from WAPA, made some interesting comments about whether or not uncertainty should even be considered in the RSE for a day-ahead time frame. I think that's one worth noting and really spending some future time on, so I wanted to flag that. Another question I think on the table that I don't know yet if there's consensus or even what the vision is if the EDAM entities all want to procure their ancillary services out of the EDAM, or if they want to have the option, or if the idea is there being an option to procure your ancillary services but not a requirement. And I think that will feed down into the inputs you showed on the chart, right? So maybe there's not an ancillary service component to that stack. Maybe there is. And I think that's a policy question that we haven't gotten to that we should spend some time on. Another one that I think that we've been talking around when we said what is lean is really the question of, are we concerned that a single LSE is coming in with insufficient resources that they own against the load they consider their responsibility? Or are we asking a question about whether the BAA has sufficient resources available to them so that we can meet those needs? And I think I've heard different stakeholders kind of lean one way or the other. George, your formulation with the BAA level would be the latter, and I think that is where I lean, just so you know. But I have heard some comments that made me feel we were moving the opposite direction, which is then where I've been asking lots of questions and trying to get a better understanding of why. What are we doing? Because if it's an LSE test, I now got more, it's more complex, and we got to talk about different stuff. And just the last one is the who counts, right? Are we, and it gets to the same point of, is it only utility-owned generation? Is it anyone? And so you noted the intertie transactions. I've been teeing that up in these conversations because I wanted to get people primed on if it's a question about the BAA, which fits well into your formulation, then imports available to meet that need, I think there's an argument they should count. If and third-party generation inside. And so I just think those are some of the big policy things that we've been teeing up, and I wanted to highlight them and make sure we noted them so that we can make sure we can wrap that up and focus more on the formulation, because that would be great. Maybe not wrap up, but talk. Thanks.
All right, Bobby? Operator, you mind unmuting Bobby Olson's line?
All right, I think I'm unmuted now, Mark. So appreciate the opportunity, Bobby Olson with SRP. And just wanted to say I do appreciate the discussion today. It has helped to kind of really get me thinking a little bit more in terms of RSC, RS test applications to EDAM entities as well as to KISO entities, how it all merges together when we start to talk about IFM, virtual bids, and everything else. I think there's a lot of gaps in terms of policy. I tend to agree that mechanics are likely to be pretty straightforward, but then kind of applicability, policy, cure, and consistency, all things for us to kind of really roll up our sleeves and make sure that we have understanding and dialogue around. The last thing I would note, and what really kind of prompted raising the hand, was going back to the last slide that George had here. And when we talk about resource limitations and being able to kind of identify maybe hydro limitations or battery limitations from an energy limitation perspective, one of the things that SRP has advocated for in past efforts for EDAM and would want to make sure it's clear here is, there are assumptions and limitations on gas burns that can be materialized, and I don't want that to be overlooked. The misalignment between gas day and energy day will, I think, be exacerbated as part of an EDAM, and really understanding the limitations of contracted transportation rights and commodity rights, as well as some of the penalty structures, will be important components to ensure that the model is trying to figure out how to at least accommodate, or at least that EDAM has some provisions around. And there's a lot there, and it's more just kind of a comment that I want to make sure that we don't miss it, because especially for those of us that are participating even within EIM in the Desert Southwest, those are foundational challenges that we run through now, and I think we have some concerns that they'll get exacerbated in an EDAM type construct. So really just placing that as a, let's not lose sight of some of the limitations that may exist with gas as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. And I definitely think, limitations to gas is something that we're going to have to grapple with here in the coming weeks. So I definitely captured that, and maybe we'll follow up with you offline to hear some of your ideas. And, maybe before I jump to my slide, and again, I'm trying to be aware of time here, Kathleen, I heard you state, does it make sense for the at the LSC level versus the EDAM entity BAA level? And I don't recall hearing, that it was going to be at the individual LSC level that's going to be subject to this test. Was there someone in particular that brought that up, or can I get a reaction from some of the other entities? And maybe Kathleen, if you don't mind getting that question back up for me by raising your hand, like unmute your line, just so we tease that out real quick.
Mark, do you want me to give more context, or do you want me to see if other stakeholders want to talk?
Give a little more context if you don't mind, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, I think it's important for the question of what is leaning that I asked, I think, the last meeting, because I think that there's reliability leaning, where a question of if we're focused on reliability and being able to support reliability, then the BAA is the right level. If we're focused on, but I'm wondering, and I can't point to a specific person, but the conversations that are around, well, LSEs need to bring, each LSE needs to do X, Y, and Z to make others feel comfortable with their participation, which maybe this has come out in more of that advisory showing conversations but it bleeds into, well, if you're going to say that that's your focus that far in advance, then by the time we get to the nearer term operational time frame, I can read into it that you want me to focus on an LSE, but that isn't really, in my mind, reliability. That is an idea of leaning that we sometimes discuss, like in a forward procurement space or in it's economic leaning. And so the harm is a different thing. And that's why I think we, keep asking questions, what's the harm that we are concerned about that we want to mitigate? Because if you said to me, it's LSEs not having enough and we have this idea because we did forward advisory showings, they needed to be sufficient, and resources are committed or dispatched from other areas, then that's a cost incurred in that area potentially. Is that the harm that people are concerned about? Or is it reliability? And I think to some extent it probably is that forward showing and the focus on LSEs doing that I think has conflated some of this. And that's the context I think I can provide.
No, that was perfect, Kathleen. I appreciate you framing that up. Let me go to Danny Johnson at the ISO first, see if I can get a reaction there. And then I just saw Alan Meck's hand come up. So Danny, if you don't mind.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So I think our thought on this has been it will be a BAA level test. I know that in the EIM, we've recently pushed through a new policy that allows sub-entities to function within EIM entities. However, even with the sub-entity functionality, the RSE will continue to be applied at the EIM entity level in the EIM. So I think we were planning on a similar framework for the EDAM RSE.
Thank you, Danny. Let's go to Alan. Alan Meck.
Hi, this is Alan Meck from San Diego Gas and Electric. To answer Kathleen's framing about are we concerned about addressing economic leaning or reliability leaning, I don't see a difference. The way I see leaning is if we had no test guaranteeing that entities and BAAs came to market resource sufficient, then let's imagine that one entity comes to market with excess capacity forward contracted. Everyone else who comes to market would have an incentive to just do nothing and lean on the market, and the value of that incentive you can easily see too. It's the difference between the price of energy versus the price of capacity, where we know that the price of capacity is quite a bit more. And if if every entity coming to market, or if every BAA coming to market had the option of paying for capacity or not paying for capacity, and they could ensure reliability either way because they're essentially just leaning on the market to make them solvent, then obviously they would do that. It's a tragedy of the commons problem, right? Everyone has an interest in overgrazing the commons until the commons is completely depleted. And so your problem of economic leaning becomes a reliability concern too. But so I see them both as being the same thing.
And Alan, you see that being at the BAA level, similar to how it is with EIM?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I keep saying it as a concern about individual LSEs, but I would think that the test would be at a BAA level. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your comments. So Kevin Smith, I'm gonna come to you, but I'm gonna ask you the same question I just asked Alan. You know, with this test similar to EIM, do you believe this should be at the BAA level?
Hi, Kevin Smith for Balancing Authority, Northern California. Yeah, we have 5 LSEs in our BA, and you know, there's times when an entity might be, let's just say, short in some hour or whatever, but you know, there's others that might be long, and so we have ways of resolving RSE within the footprint. I think it just is logical, makes sense that it's at the EDAM entity level or the BAA level. For simplicity, and let the BAAs, some of which are single BAA and LSEs, and then others which have multiple load-serving entities within their footprint, you know, let the EDAM entity deal with the details of how they resolve internally. But as to the market and the market operator, it should be it should be interfacing between the EDAM entity BAA and the CAISO or market operator, or the market on the whole.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. All right, Christina, I'm going to maybe 10 more minutes to spend a little time, get a little bit more into details. You know, I think from this point forward, what I'm hearing is let's assume it's at the BAA level. To the extent there's opposition of that, or some other thinking, you know, please reach out. This is a forum for other entities to present, you know, on different various topics and their stance. So I would appreciate that. And Christina, if you don't mind jumping one more slide, I think for the forecast requirement, as George put it, you know, what level of reserves, what level of uncertainty should we consider? I did hear, I don't recall from who, that I think it was Tong, that we may not want to consider uncertainty at all. And if that's the case, Tong, maybe reach out to me offline. We could get some presentations together and get you on the agenda in the upcoming weeks. So for the next 8 minutes here, before I turn it to my colleague, Bob Cott, let's see if we can make some headway on some of these scope topics here. So qualification and counting of resources, and I want to preface it with that are modeled within the EDAM BAA, kind of building off George's previous slide. Conventional resources, you know, as Bob brought up from SRP, there's some gas burn constraints that may or may not need to be considered in the RSC. Hydro, energy storage, variable energy resources, and MSGs, and then third-party non-contracted supply, and then lastly, demand response. Next slide, please, Christina. All right. So conventional resource, I'm going to call it with air quotes here, right? We have a 100 megawatt PMAX unit with 1 daily start. You know, given the above resource can operate at PMAX for the full day, what makes sense from an accounting standpoint to credit this resource towards the RSC? Does the single daily start characteristic limit how this resource is counted? George had previously mentioned that we may also have to consider startup time. So I would like to get a reaction on, you know, what makes sense here with 1 daily start, as well as potentially the startup time, keeping in mind that, you know, again, this is just a screen and, you know, keeping things simple. Let me go to Dan Williams. I saw Dan's hand up first, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Dan from CES. Just a clarification on the prior slide. When you say modeled and within a BA, I'm assuming you would also count any external resources that have a must-offer obligation, either say their RA import resources for the CAISO or their external resource that under a PPA or even has just made a daily sale or of some sort to a EDAM BA. Am I thinking right?
No, good question there, Dan. Danny, did you want to address that?
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Dan. I think that we will look to include those resources. That is a discussion that's a little bit predicated on the results of the transmission discussion that is going on. So we wanted to try to address the resources internal to each BAA, give the work group two a little bit of time to breathe, and then address the import type resources, be these CAISO RA contracts or WSPP contracts, and how those would be credited for the RSC. Just at a little bit later date.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you, Dan. So, Christian, you mind jumping ahead one more slide and see if we can get some comments on this? I haven't heard from Carrie Bentley today. Carrie?
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I wanted to confirm that you meant PMAX and not NQC, that we really are talking about the full bid range curve and not doing a check on RA for internal resources.
No, apologies if I said NQC, PMAX.
PMAX. Okay, just with Dan's comment, you didn't correct him, and I want to make really clear that we're not talking about a deliverability check in any way, and it is just pure resources. And so because my thinking on this is that if we're not doing a deliverability check, we don't need to get too specific about the resource counting rules, because we're not even checking whether these resources are behind a transmission constraint. So a broad brush approach generally, I think, should be preferred, or at least we should be consistent on how detailed we are in this. So if we are taking the broad brush and not checking whether we're behind deliverability constraints, a resource like this, I think, should be able to count, across the full day.
Thank you, Carrie. Can I get do we have common agreements on that? Let's go to Tong Wu. Tom, you may be double muted. And again, I would like to focus on this slide, given we have about 4 minutes left, and then we'll obviously pick up this conversation next Wednesday.
Well, you can skip to somebody else then. I have comments on previous things, but
okay, we'll
go ahead.
Offline, Tom. Sounds good. Kathleen?
Hey, great, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just want to flag another thing. It has to do with the modeled within BAA. I heard what Danny said about it being two-phased. Can we capture that? It just seems a little premature to write that if we intend to come back and do that rule. Like, we're going to talk about it, we just aren't doing it right now. Does that make sense?
Danny, did you want to respond to that?
I mean, we can write that down and have Bob reflect that in the notes, but it is something that we plan to address. I'd like to kind of follow up on Carrie's comment a little bit too. We're intentionally, I think, starting with some of the more simple resource counting types. While this is a counting test, I think if we go through the different resource types, you'll see that the counting assumptions will potentially be a little bit controversial if the EIM RSC is any reflection. So.
All right. So with that, I think that's a good segue, Danny. Maybe we get through one more. Oh, what's that, Kathleen? Go ahead.
Give Danny the space to keep talking. But I did have one more thing I wanted just to note on the I want to echo the thing. I heard something else I wanted to clear, is that the types of resources, whether they're intertie transactions or they're the equivalent of a non-participating resource that has already been procured by the BAA, that are going to be needing to be counted in the test. Just want to clarify that while some of that might be on long-term contracts and the equivalent and probably a non-participating resource, we wouldn't want to exclude that. And I think that's I thought the last conversation was productive, that this is about, are we resource sufficient in an energy time frame? And so I did hear some allusion to them being external resources on contracts. So I think we need to be careful that that's another big policy question. And our current thinking based on what we just talked about is they should not have to be on contract. They don't need to be firm. They're the bid range submitted into the market to be counted towards available to be dispatched. Thanks.
Counted for, I guess I'd like to follow up on that, Kathleen. Counted for who? If they're not under contract, who gets to count that capacity?
I think it's a great question. So my understanding in the resource sufficiency test goal is to look at a load within an area and see what can be dispatched to serve that load. And so if it's an intertie import offer at a tie point that can be dispatched to inject into that area, then that should be counted.
Yeah, I think that one of the principles with this working group has been respecting the existing RA and IRP programs that do rely on import energy. So that's something we plan to do, and I think Bob has kind of notated that we will address this in upcoming meetings.
And I think the only nuance I was trying to flag, Danny, is that it could also include marketers that are offering energy in a daily time frame to the BAA that can also be dispatched to serve that load. And it's not just the long-term RA. And so we wouldn't want to discount them from being included if we're truly testing support reliability. Yeah.
We actually have a slide later in the sequencing of the different types or permeations of resources, which specifically addresses like the IPPs who aren't tied to any forward contracts and how they could be accounted for or accredited. So that is something we plan to address.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Danny. Carrie, I see your hand, and I will come to you next. Let's go to the next slide, please, Christina. So as Danny mentioned, you know, this deck gets a little deeper with the associated resource counting rules. And in this example, let's talk about a hydro facility that has a 25 megawatt PMAX with a 200 megawatt hour daily energy limit. You know, given this resource can run at its full capacity for a total of 8 hours, what makes sense from a counting standpoint to credit this resource towards the RSC? Carrie, if you can help answer what you believe to be the case for this question, I would appreciate it. And I'm going to turn to you. You would have to unmute yourself, Carrie, if the operator hasn't already done so. There you go.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So again, Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. First to ask that we just get really specific in our language when we talk about RA versus non-RA and what can count in these tests. Danny, when you talked about respecting the RA program, I do worry that we're going to conflate needing an RA contract internal to the CAISO to count for this. And it's my understanding that that's not true. So perhaps for the next working group, we could have just a couple slides that writes down, you know, internal, external, RA, non-RA, and just clarify just to make sure we're on the same page. And then again, on each of these individual ones, I would ask that we come up with just a general principle rather than a case-by-case basis. Some of this seems very fuzzy to me because, again, if you're not checking, you're behind a constraint and you're going to allow very loose deliverability rules, then why are we doing these individual hourly checks? So to me, a broader principle about what counts and what exactly we need to check and how tight we want to be on the uncertainty requirement will all inform answers to this. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. But I think, you know, a case-by-case basis, you know, we're not supposed to be discriminatory toward different resource types. So we have to treat everyone equally. So a more principled approach, I think, would be better.
No, thank you for your comments there, Carrie. And I guess I would ask other BAs is, you know, EDAM entities, would it make sense to allow this type of resource to have the full 25 megawatt credit for all hours given this daily energy limit constraint? Let me go to Steve Kearns. Steve?
So in order for the 25 megawatts to be counted for all hours, my understanding is that the market participant would have to submit a bid for 25 megawatts for all hours, correct? Is that right, George?
Yeah, I think that's the starting point, is there's an offer for all 25 hours.
So the risk with that is that they could get awarded that 25 megawatts for each hour.
Well, I don't want to speak for George, but my understanding is the market would honor that. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that the current participation in the day-ahead market is indicated by submitting bids, and there is no requirement, unless you're an array resource under the California Array Program, to submit bids for every hour in the day. You could participate for a set of hours in the trading day. So the bids that you submit, they don't necessarily have to span the entire 24-hour period, and will only use for the resource sufficiency evaluation the bids that are submitted for the specific hour. So if you essentially, as a resource, don't participate in a set of hours, you will not have contributions to the RSC for your BAA in those hours, obviously, right? Does this provide some clarification?
It does, but I wonder also if there's another option here where the optimization could actually apply an additional constraint of the energy limit.
Oh, we do. We do have that in the optimization in the market. Unfortunately, the RSC is not an optimization, so we don't have the ability to enforce this type of constraints in the RSC. And
I would just say at the end of the day, that's what's important, is that the awards that get dispatched by the market honor that energy limit. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Right? And
in fact, I agree. I agree. It's just that we have to find a way to do it in a meaningful and simple manner. And that's why I was suggesting that perhaps one way that we can do that is by assuming a certain profile of how this resource, which is energy limited, will be used during the day, what it makes sense for it. And then based on that profile, calculate its contributions to the RSC.
I'll get back to my earlier point, where another way to do a resource efficiency test in the day ahead rather than an hourly test would be to do a peak hour test for capacity where you're worried about it, and then do an energy check to make sure that 200 megawatt hours meets your obligations over the course of the day. You could pass that energy test for the 24-hour period, and then do a specific capacity test for the hours of concern. It's just something to think about.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's something
Steve.
to think about, Steve. At least like the thing that jumps out at, and the way we've always sequenced this that I just want to get back to, is the bids that will be used to pass the RSC gives everybody who's participating in EDAM confidence that there will be sufficient bids in each hour, so we can clear the market. And so when we start doing that peak check and then a daily check, it could call into question that paradigm.
Yes. And now we're back to the balance of simplicity and accuracy.
Yep. All right. So I apologize to all those in the queue. I've written down your names. I do encourage individuals to reach out to me via the EDAM link that Christina proposed earlier, to the extent you would like to present on an idea. Jeff Spires brought up a point where, maybe it's a good idea to go back and look at some of the previous material and where we landed previously with EDAM and use that as a starting point. I kind of heard that common idea there. So Jeff, if you're comfortable presenting on any of those topics, please reach out to me and we can coordinate. With the time left, I want to hand it over to Bob. Before I do, I just want to let everyone know that this coming Monday is a holiday, so our next meeting will be on Wednesday, and we will follow back up with this conversation on walking through some of these resources and going from there. Bob, I'm going to turn it to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, okay. Just want to make sure that I'm being heard there before I start. So yeah, just kind of running quickly through the discussion of the days of today. We had a discussion about advisory runs and some different options. There are a lot of suggestions, and I think the consensus was that we need to put something in writing and then send that out for review. There was clarification given on the 45-day advisory showing that that's been taken off, and the group's going to work on details and bring that back. We got into some discussions about the forecast, and then that led to George giving some overview of details. Again, I think there seemed to be some comments about us developing some things in writing around these topics and to bring those back. There was some questions presented about should uncertainty be considered. and some questions about whether EDAM entities should procure AS in the EDAM, and then a question about leaning and which entity is going to demonstrate that. And I think there seemed to be an answer on that point that's at the BA level. If entities want to present an alternative to that, they should come forward and ask to present on that. There was a suggestion that we consider assumptions and limitations on gas system, which I think Mark you suggested we will be considering those gas system limitations and the difference between the gas day and the EDAM time frame. And then when we got into the resource qualification and counting discussion, there's some topics about resource transfers, non-participating resources, and I think, and then some suggestion we consider RA and non-RA, and I believe we will be having further discussions about various resource types in our future meetings. So that's the summary for today.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. And we are at 3 o'clock. I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you all who participated today. And I definitely look forward to continued conversation on this topic. Have a great rest of your afternoon.